Governor Gavin Newsom didn't flinch often on camera, but when Vice President J.D. Vance said, "Governor, I want you to meet someone," you could see the micro pause. Not a dramatic gasp, not a cartoon double-take, just that split second where the brain runs through every possible answer and comes up empty. Vance's next line, "Her name is Jennifer, she's in the audience tonight," landed like a paper cut that somehow makes the whole room bleed. Newsom's smile stayed on, technically, but it stopped doing the job it was hired for. And if you were one of the millions watching, you felt it too. The moment when a policy forum threatens to become something messier, human, and harder to spin. CNN had dressed the stage the way cable news always does when it wants serious. Bright lights, dark backgrounds, glossy floors, and the faint sense that everyone's being filmed by a machine that never blinks. The date was framed like it mattered, October 23rd, 2025, because television loves a timestamp the way courtrooms love a record. This was billed as a California crisis forum in Los Angeles. A 2-hour grind through homelessness, housing, crime, business flight, and the general mood of a state that's always either the future or a cautionary tale, depending on who's talking. Dana Bash played moderator, the responsible adult holding the clipboard while two powerful men argued about whose reality counted. Newsom came to defend a record, Vance came to cross-examine it, and the audience came for the kind of tension you can't manufacture unless you're willing to risk someone actually saying something true. I'm going to be upfront about how I'm telling this, as a dramatized account of a political night that could happen in a country where optics are treated like outcomes. In other words, take it as a narrative about incentives, not a sworn deposition about literal events. Because the point isn't whether a specific person said a specific sentence at a specific second. The point is what happens when a carefully managed story meets a question that doesn't care about management. And if you think that's unfair, ask yourself why fair always seems to mean comfortable for the person with the microphone. Isn't the whole idea of a public forum that discomfort is part of the deal? Newsom's team acted like this would be routine, the way seasoned operators always do right before routine stops being available. He walked in with that polished governor vibe, tailored suit, practiced warmth, the kind of posture that says, "I've been briefed, I've been trained, I've been focus grouped." He spent years in rooms where the questions are tough, but the boundaries are understood, where the story bends but doesn't break. Vance, in this telling, came in quieter, with the expression of someone who believes the narrative is already guilty, and the only remaining task is to read the evidence aloud. You don't have to like him to recognize the strategy. Keep it calm, keep it simple, let the other guy exhaust himself, trying to argue with numbers. Dana Bash opened the night the way moderators do when they're hoping to keep two ambitious politicians from turning the set into a demolition derby. She talked about civility, solutions, and what Californians are experiencing. That last phrase doing a lot of work because it can mean anything from rent prices to vibes. Newsom started with the greatest hits: California's economy, California's innovation, California's leadership, California's not perfect, but trying. He pointed to big investments, big commitments, big compassion, the kind of language that sounds moral, even when the outcomes are unresolved. Vance's reply, in this version, didn't try to out-inspire him. It tried to out-audit him. The first hour was the usual tug-of-war, one man describing complexity, the other insisting complexity is what politicians say when they're losing. Newsom leaned on structure, programs, budgets, agencies, partnerships, because government speaks in nouns when it wants to avoid verbs. Vance leaned on contrast, before and after, claimed and delivered. promised, and produced, because contrast creates a clean storyline that viewers can take home. And the audience sat there absorbing the subtext that neither side was going to concede a moral point, only a tactical one. That's modern politics in a nutshell. Nobody's wrong, everybody's offended, and the public is expected to clap for whichever performance feels less insulting. When homelessness came up, the discussion did what it always does. It became a war over numbers and definitions. Newsom referenced large spending, large efforts, the scale of the challenge, and the idea that you don't unwind decades of failure with a single bill and a press release. Vance responded the way critics often do, by asking what the money bought, and why the visible suffering still looks so stubbornly visible. Even in a hypothetical retelling, that question hits because it's the one taxpayers ask in their kitchens. Where did it go and why doesn't it show? And when those questions are asked on television, they sound less like policy and more like accusation, even if nobody uses the word accuse. This is where the tone can shift fast, because talking about homelessness abstractly is one thing, but talking about it with a face is another. If Vance cited auditor reports, cost per unit estimates, and headlines about bureaucratic delays, he did it with the rhythm of someone stacking bricks. Newsom, on the defensive, would do what leaders often do: broaden the lens, invoke constraints, mention local control, point to long timelines and hard trade-offs. None of that is automatically wrong, but none of it is emotionally satisfying either. And television is an emotion machine. So the debate kept moving, and you could feel the producers waiting for a moment, the kind that can be clipped and played on loop like a national mood ring. The business exodus segment, in this telling, followed the same script it always does. One side says companies are leaving, the other side says companies are coming. And both can be true if you choose the right slice of time and the right definition of leaving. Vance would cite names, big brands, big headquarters, big relocations, because proper nouns are persuasive, even when the broader picture is complicated. Newsom would counter with jobs, investment, and the idea that California remains the engine, because engines are supposed to roar even when the dashboard lights are blinking. And the audience would do that little head tilt people do when they suspect both men are selling something. Crime, predictably, became a battle over perception versus measurement. One side leans on statistics, the other leans on videos, and whichever one you trust probably says more about your media diet than the actual situation on the ground. Newsom would emphasize reforms, data trends, and the difference between sensational stories and statewide reality. Vance would emphasize public fear, visible disorder, and the claim that people are being told to ignore what they can see with their own eyes. And then the moderator would try to braid the two together, because admitting that both data and feeling matter is the only way to keep a town hall from becoming a screaming match. But then came the line that changed the temperature. "Governor, I want you to meet someone." It's such a simple sentence, almost polite, which is exactly why it works as a trap. If your opponent starts shouting, you can dismiss him as angry. If he speaks softly, you have to lean in, and leaning in is surrendering control. Newsom's face, at least as I imagine it in this narrative, did that quick scan politicians do. Who is this? Who booked this? What am I walking into? And that's when the camera found Jennifer. Jennifer stood up in the audience, and the room did what rooms do when a real story enters. It got quiet in a way that feels heavier than silence. She was described as early 50s, worn down not in a glamorous, hard life, made me strong way, but in the plain way exhaustion writes itself on a body. Her clothes looked clean, not sloppy, which matters because America loves to decide who deserves sympathy based on laundry. Newsom's posture changed into empathy mode, the standard equipment of public leadership, the facial expression that says, "I care," even if the brain is screaming, "How do I answer this?" And Jennifer opened with the sentence that makes every powerful person's stomach drop. "You don't know me, but I know you." She said she had been a teacher, 5th grade, at Monroe Elementary in San Francisco for 17 years. She said she loved the work, loved the kids, loved the rhythms of a classroom that make the outside world feel like it can be organized. Then she told a familiar story. COVID hit. Budgets cracked. Furloughs happened. Temporary became permanent. And the floor dropped out. She described losing her apartment, trying to recover, falling behind, and then discovering that falling behind in an expensive city is basically a trap door. And she said she had been homeless for 3.5 years. At this point, you could almost hear the audience recalculating what they thought they were watching. Because it's one thing to debate homelessness as a challenge, and another to hear it described as sleeping in doorways, waiting lists, fear, illness, and the long stretch of time that turns crisis into identity. Jennifer talked about shelters that felt unsafe, hotlines that felt like loops, applications that went nowhere, and the constant grind of trying to stay alive without becoming invisible. If she mentioned being assaulted or robbed, she did it without theatrics, which is often how real trauma comes out, flat, factual, and almost ashamed that it's asking for space. And then she delivered the line that made the studio feel like it had lost oxygen. "And you walked past me twice." That's the kind of claim that is hard to verify in real time and impossible to ignore in real time. Newsom's mind, if you were reading it like a ticker, would be racing through responses. Apologize, question the memory, emphasize limits, offer help, redirect to policy. Jennifer didn't let the moment drift. She pinned it to place and time. Pacific Heights, Filbert Street, an evening around 7, a doorway on his street. She described eye contact, the brief recognition, the step around her, and the continuation of his evening like she wasn't there. And if you're Newsom in that chair, what do? Deny it and look heartless? Accept it and look careless? Or qualify it and look slippery? Jennifer's second story widened the contrast, at least in the way it was told. She said she ended up near Yountville, outside the French Laundry area, after being told there might be shelter space, and there wasn't. She described seeing a group dressed well, laughing, moving toward a restaurant that represents a whole class of life most people only see on special occasions, if ever. She said she recognized Newsom among them, saw the quick glance, and watched him disappear into a place where the lighting is warm and the plates look like art. Then she asked about the cost, and she framed it not as jealousy, but as math. How can there be money for this, and not for someone like her? And that question is lethal, because it's not a policy memo. It's a moral riddle. Vance, in this narrative, let her speak, and then stepped back in with the cleanest weapon politics has: a number. He cited California's homeless count, framed as roughly 181,000 people, and emphasized the proportion of national homelessness concentrated in one state. He cited the state's spending, often described in headlines as tens of billions, and he framed it as a per-person sum that sounds obscene to anyone paying rent. He did the rhetorical math out loud because math, spoken slowly, is a kind of theater that feels like proof. And then he made the move that feels like a verdict without using the word. Jennifer is what the debate is about. Newsom, cornered, would instinctively reach for the safest truth any executive can claim. No leader can solve every individual case personally. That sentence is logically correct and politically disastrous. Because the problem in the room isn't logic. It's the collision between power and proximity. If he said in a strained voice that he couldn't be expected to recognize and solve each person's situation, viewers wouldn't hear the practicality. They would hear the distance, the implication that a human life is a statistic you regret, not a neighbor you respond to. And Jennifer's expression, as described, didn't need to perform anger. Disappointment is a stronger indictment because it sounds like the last shred of faith leaving the body. What follows in a story like this is predictable, which is why it's so effective. The audience reacts, gasps, murmurs, maybe a boo, because people don't want to be the villain in their own living rooms. Vance sharpens the moral frame. Nobody expects miracles, but people do expect awareness, humility, and something resembling congruence between rhetoric and behavior. Newsom tries to recover with compassion, with program language, with "we're working on it," because governors are trained to speak in management, not confession. And the moderator tries to move the show forward because the show has to end, even when the question that just landed has no clean ending. Here's the part that matters beyond partisan pleasure. This is what modern politics has become, and it isn't going away. The era of abstract debates is collapsing under the weight of personalized, clip-ready morality plays where a single anecdote can dominate 2 hours of data. Is that fair to policymakers who deal with systems and constraints, not individual miracles? Maybe not. But fairness isn't the same as accountability, and the public has been starving for accountability long enough to accept imperfect substitutes. And when a substitute looks like a teacher who says she slept on a sidewalk while leaders ate behind glass, people treat it as the only truth that counts. If you're a Newsom supporter, you might say this is emotional manipulation, the use of a vulnerable person to score points, a reality TV trick dressed up as civic dialogue. If you're a Newsom critic, you might say this is accountability finally taking the stage, the human cost being read aloud where it can't be ignored. If you're somewhere in the middle, you might just feel uneasy because the whole exchange suggests something bigger than one governor or one vice president. It suggests that our systems can spend huge sums and still leave people in doorways, and our leaders can talk about compassion while appearing personally insulated from the consequences. And that uneasy feeling is exactly what viral politics feeds on, because discomfort is the most reliable fuel in American media. In the imagined aftermath, the clips spread before the forum even fully wrapped. That's not a conspiracy, that's just the physics of attention in 2025, where every sentence can be isolated, repackaged, and turned into a symbol. Newsom's defenders would rush to add context. Budgets are complicated, local governments control many levers, homelessness is tied to housing supply, addiction, mental health, and economic displacement. Newsom's critics would refuse the context, because context feels like an excuse when a person is standing there saying she's been waiting 3 years. And Vance's team, if they're competent, would keep the message painfully simple. You can't govern a crisis you don't visibly feel. I'm not going to tell you who won, because that's the trap we always fall into, treating politics like a sport where the score matters more than the conditions outside the stadium. The more important question is what this kind of moment does to public trust, to policy debate, and to the way leaders present themselves. If every forum becomes a trial, leaders will either get sharper and more honest, or they'll get more scripted and more evasive, and neither outcome is guaranteed to make anyone safer. If one story can dominate every statistic, we risk turning policy into a contest of who can find the most devastating anecdote, regardless of representativeness. But if statistics can dominate every story, we risk turning suffering into a rounding error. And that's how people end up believing nobody in power is listening. So what should the viewer take from a narrative like this? even as fiction-leaning commentary. Maybe it's the reminder that investment isn't a moral achievement unless results show up where people live, not just where reports are filed. Maybe it's the reminder that leaders can be both sincere and insufficient, that compassion can be real and still fail, and that failure doesn't disappear because intentions were good. Maybe it's the reminder that politics is now an arena where credibility lives and dies on camera, and nobody gets the luxury of a quiet correction anymore. And maybe it's the unsettling thought that the country is so hungry for consequences that we've started outsourcing accountability to viral moments, like that's a governing model. If this story sounds brutal, it's because it's built from a truth that isn't partisan. The gap between what institutions say and what people experience is widening. When a teacher says she fell out of the middle class and into a doorway, that's not a red story or a blue story. It's an American story. When a governor says the crisis is complex, that can be true. And it can also sound like a way to keep the pain at a safe distance. When a vice president turns one life into an argument, that can be cynical, and it can also be the only language television understands. And the viewers, millions of them, are left deciding which discomfort feels more honest. If you want a neat ending, you won't get one, because crises like homelessness don't wrap when the credits roll. The person on the sidewalk still has to wake up the next morning and solve problems that no moderator can pause and no camera can zoom away. The leader still has to govern a system where money moves slower than misery and solutions take longer than news cycles tolerate. The critic still has to decide whether the point is to improve outcomes or just to prove failure. And the audience still has to ask itself the hardest question of all. Do we want performance, or do we want answers? Even when answers are complicated, imperfect, and painfully slow. If you've watched enough American politics, you know this part is usually the reset. The spin rooms fire up, statements get drafted, friendly commentators are booked, and within 48 hours the narrative is supposed to soften. That's how it normally works. Outrage peaks, then fades, then gets replaced by the next outrage. But some moments don't cooperate with that schedule, and this one, at least in this telling, had the feel of something that refused to be filed away. Not because it proved anything conclusively, but because it raised questions that didn't come with an obvious off-ramp. The first question was the simplest and the hardest. How much does personal distance matter in public leadership? Gavin Newsom didn't deny homelessness existed. He had spent years acknowledging it publicly, often emotionally. He didn't deny that the problem was severe, expensive, or morally urgent. What rattled people wasn't denial. It was the visible gap between language and proximity, between knowing about suffering and appearing untouched by it. And once that gap is perceived, every policy defense sounds like it's coming from behind glass. Supporters rushed to contextualize, and, to be fair, context matters. California's homelessness crisis predates Gavin Newsom's governorship and stretches back through decades of housing shortages, zoning battles, mental health deinstitutionalization, addiction epidemics, and economic inequality. No governor inherits a blank slate, especially not in a state of 40 million people with layers of local authority and federal constraints. That's all true, and it's important, and it doesn't disappear because a story goes viral. But context explains complexity. It doesn't erase responsibility, and voters rarely confuse the two. Critics, on the other hand, framed the moment as proof rather than provocation. To them, Jennifer wasn't an anecdote. She was evidence, a living receipt for what they argued was systemic mismanagement. They didn't ask whether Gavin Newsom could personally fix every case. They asked whether the system under his leadership appeared capable of fixing enough of them. And once that question lodged itself in the public conversation, it didn't require hyperbole to stay alive. It fed itself on repetition, on clips, on the uncomfortable stillness of that exchange. J.D. Vance's role in all this deserves scrutiny too, not just applause or condemnation. He didn't claim to have solved homelessness. He didn't present a fully costed alternative plan in that moment. What he did was reframe the debate from abstract governance to moral contrast, and that's a powerful move in American politics. Some saw it as accountability, others as exploitation, and both interpretations can exist at the same time without canceling each other out. The real question isn't whether the tactic was fair, but why it worked so well. It worked because Americans are tired of hearing that problems are complicated without seeing proportional urgency in the response. They're tired of press conferences that promise comprehensive strategies, while sidewalks remain crowded with tents. They're tired of being told to trust processes that seem to generate more reports than results. When someone like Jennifer appears, calmly stating that she tried the system and fell through it for years, complexity starts to sound like a shield. And shields, once identified as shields, tend to draw fire. In the days that followed, the commentary fractured along predictable lines, but with an edge that felt sharper than usual. Progressive outlets emphasized the cruelty of turning a homeless woman's life into a political weapon, warning that emotional ambushes discourage serious policy-making. Conservative outlets framed the exchange as a long-overdue reckoning, arguing that polite deference had allowed failure to persist unchecked. Centrist analysts tried to split the difference, acknowledging the moral punch of the moment while cautioning against governing by viral confrontation. None of these takes were irrational, and none of them fully resolved the discomfort. What made the story linger wasn't just Jennifer's testimony, but Gavin Newsom's response to it. Not the apology itself, but the phrasing that followed. The instinctive retreat into administrative limits. I can't be expected to personally recognize and solve every individual person's situation is a sentence that makes sense in a boardroom. On a debate stage, under studio lights, after a woman says she slept outside your house, it lands very differently. It sounds less like realism and more like resignation, even if that wasn't the intent. That's the curse of high office in the age of high-definition politics. Every sentence is stripped of nuance and judged as a symbol. Leaders aren't evaluated only on what they mean, but on what their words appear to reveal about their instincts. And instincts, fair or not, are treated as character. Once that happens, policy arguments struggle to regain center stage. Behind the scenes, Newsom's team reportedly did what any competent team would do. They reached out to housing advocates, highlighted ongoing initiatives, pointed to recent funding tranches, emphasized partnerships with cities and counties. They stressed that no single encounter defines a governorship and warned against elevating personal anecdotes over systemic data. They weren't wrong to do so. Abandoning data entirely would be a disaster. But the data now had to compete with a story that had already colonized the public imagination. Meanwhile, Jennifer herself became an object of national curiosity, which is a strange and often uncomfortable position. Some wanted her to symbolize everything broken about California governance. Others worried she was being cast in a role that would ultimately do more harm than good, exposing her to attention without delivering structural change. She spoke cautiously in subsequent interviews, at least in this narrative, careful not to accuse, careful not to claim knowledge she didn't have. Her restraint, ironically, made her more credible to audiences already skeptical of political theater. J.D. Vance, for his part, leaned into the broader theme without repeating the specific confrontation endlessly. He talked about outcomes over intentions, about systems that feel compassionate but don't deliver, about the danger of governing by press release. He framed his critique as philosophical rather than personal, even though everyone understood who it was aimed at. That choice mattered, because it allowed supporters to see him as principled rather than opportunistic, at least on the surface. Whether that impression holds over time is another question entirely. The deeper issue raised by the exchange goes beyond Gavin Newsom or J.D. Vance as individuals. It speaks to the fragility of trust in large-scale governance when everyday experience contradicts official messaging. When leaders say they are meeting the moment, but the moment still feels unmet, frustration looks for a face. Sometimes it finds a governor. Sometimes it finds a mayor. Sometimes it finds an entire ideology. In this case, it found a stage, a microphone, and a woman willing to speak. There's also an uncomfortable lesson here about how politics rewards visibility over resolution. Jennifer's appearance forced a conversation that years of reports, audits, and hearings had not. That should trouble anyone who believes good policy is built quietly through expertise rather than spectacle. If the only way to pierce the fog is through a dramatic confrontation, what does that say about the health of the system? And if leaders start anticipating these moments, will they govern differently or just prepare better defenses? Gavin Newsom's long-term political future in this telling became an open question overnight. Not because one forum determines an election, but because narratives harden quickly in a media environment optimized for repetition. Once someone is labeled out of touch, every subsequent story is filtered through that frame. A ribbon cutting looks like posturing. A policy announcement looks like damage control. A speech looks rehearsed. Escaping that gravity well requires either time or transformation, and time is rarely generous in politics. Yet, it would be a mistake to declare any career over based on a single exchange, no matter how intense. American politics is littered with figures who survived moments that seemed fatal at the time. Voters have short memories, especially when new crises crowd out old ones. But voters also have instincts, and instincts are harder to reset than polls. Once doubt seeps in, it doesn't need to dominate. It just needs to linger. For California itself, the exchange reopened debates that never really close. Should homelessness policy prioritize speed over process, even if that means loosening regulations progressives once fought for? Is it better to build imperfect housing quickly or perfect housing slowly? How much bureaucracy is protection, and how much is self-preservation? These questions don't have easy answers, but they become unavoidable when the human cost is made visible. Ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. It just pushes them to the next stage. There's also the moral hazard of personalization to consider. If policy debates hinge on who can produce the most compelling individual story, the loudest voices may crowd out the most representative ones. Jennifer's experience may resonate deeply, but it isn't the only homelessness experience, nor does it map neatly onto every case. Governing by anecdote risks oversimplification, even when the anecdote is real and painful. Balancing empathy with evidence is harder than choosing one over the other, but that balance is exactly what leadership demands. J.D. Vance's critics pointed out that moral contrast can slide into moral superiority if left unchecked. Calling attention to failure is easier than building systems that succeed under pressure. It's fair to ask what Vance's preferred solutions would look like in practice, not just in rhetoric. Would they withstand the same scrutiny, the same unforgiving spotlight, the same collision with reality? Those questions matter, even if they didn't dominate the forum itself. At its core, the moment highlighted how politics increasingly functions as a referendum on authenticity. Not authenticity as in relatable, but authenticity as in alignment between words, actions, and lived reality. When leaders appear aligned, voters forgive mistakes. When they appear misaligned, even correct statements sound hollow. The forum became less about homelessness and more about whether Gavin Newsom still felt aligned with the people he governed. That's a dangerous place for any politician to be, because alignment is subjective and constantly shifting. It's shaped by media, by personal experience, by economic stress, by cultural mood. A leader can lose alignment without changing anything, simply because conditions change faster than messaging adapts. In that sense, the exchange wasn't just about Gavin Newsom's decisions, but about the limits of modern political storytelling. When reality intrudes, the story has to change or it breaks. For viewers, the lingering impact was less about who spoke better and more about what felt unresolved. Jennifer didn't walk off stage with housing. The policies didn't suddenly become clearer or more effective. No executive order was signed under the studio lights. What remained was a sense that something important had been said, and nothing had been fixed, which is a familiar feeling in American life. That familiarity may be the most damning part of all. As weeks passed in this narrative, the moment settled into the broader cultural memory as a reference point. Commentators invoked the Jennifer question, the way earlier generations invoked the Katrina question, or the Lehman moment. Not because it explained everything, but because it captured a feeling of disconnect in a single image. Those images don't govern, but they influence who people trust to govern. And trust, once cracked, doesn't reseal easily. If there's a takeaway here that doesn't reduce the story to heroes and villains, it's this. Large systems fail quietly for a long time before they fail loudly. And when they fail loudly, the sound often comes from someone with nothing left to lose. Jennifer didn't speak like an activist or a strategist. She spoke like someone describing gravity. Gavin Newsom didn't respond like a villain. He responded like an executive confronted with a moral demand his training didn't prepare him to meet. J.D. Vance didn't act like a savior. He acted like a prosecutor who knows that juries remember faces more than spreadsheets. None of that proves intent, malice, or virtue. It proves only that the distance between power and experience has become politically explosive. In an era where everyone is filmed and nothing stays local, that distance is harder to manage than ever. Leaders can either shrink it through visible change or hope the next news cycle buries it. History suggests hope is not a strategy. The forum ended, the clips circulated, and life in California went on, messy and unresolved. People still slept outside, people still worked in offices, debating solutions. People still argued online about what should have been said. Gavin Newsom continued governing, J.D. Vance continued positioning, and Jennifer continued living with the consequences of a system that hadn't caught her. The story didn't conclude. It paused, the way real political stories always do. And the pause itself became the question hanging in the air, waiting for an answer no one has quite figured out how to give.